Hi everyone, my name is Janki and I am a senior studying English and Political Science. My topic is entitled Grief, Lost and Found, Diversifying Sources on the 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War, and I was advised by Dr. Mohammed Zaman, who is a professor in the College of Engineering and who is also the director of the Center on Forced Displacement. To provide some background on the 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War, it happened in 1971, and as you can see here, this is currently Pakistan and this is currently Bangladesh. But before 1971, these two separated land masses were one nation. But due to some conflicts, this little landmass wanted to secede from the larger area of Pakistan, and it led to a year-long war, which is called the 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War, and it led to the death and displacement of millions of individuals across borders. I am interested in this topic because I spent the last 3 years working with Dr. Zaman, studying statelessness and displacement in South Asia, specifically focusing on the ethnic Bengali population of Pakistan who are currently stateless because of discriminatory practices that persist from the xenophobic attitudes that were promoted during the 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War. My main question is to essentially look at what roles journalistic, academic, and literary sources play within the context of conflict and displacement, focusing on the 1971 case of South Asia. And I look at these three sources in depth, and I look at them through the lens of memorialization, which is the process of recording testimonies, stories, and oral accounts. Before I dive into my sources, I took a look at interviews where I had conversations with people from Pakistan and from Bangladesh who either lived through the conflict themselves or who knew people who and heard stories from them about their experiences. I got a chance to speak with these two individuals, and through these conversations, I found that there are a lot of antagonistic attitudes that they believe that the other side holds against them. And this leads to some disconnect between these two societies. And I wanted to see where this disconnection was coming from, and I wanted to see if there was a way to begin to resolve these disconnections. The first source that I looked at, or the first category of sources that I looked at, are newspapers. So as you can see here, this is an actual newspaper issue, and this is it was initially called the Pakistan Observer, but after secession in 1971 it became known as the Bangladesh Observer. It was under, I want you to draw your attention to the martial law orders right here. It essentially means that anything and everything that was published in these newspapers was censored by the government, and it had to be approved by the government of Pakistan, or then West Pakistan. So anything that was published in these newspapers here on was censored and essentially not completely accurate. Here you can see this is the two issues side by side. This is from December 13, 1971, right before secession, and this is from December 18, 1971, right after secession. It was called the Pakistan Observer, and then it became known as just the Observer, and then essentially it became known as the Bangladesh Observer. I want to also draw your attention to the difference in languages used by these two issues of the same newspaper. So before secession, it called the Armed Forces of Pakistan valiant, and it called the Indian Air Forces the enemies, and it drew the audience's attention to all of the violent actions taken by the Indian Army. As you can see here, another 14 enemy tanks destroyed. Very next issue, the language changes drastically, where the valiant armed forces of Pakistan get turned to the barbarous Pakistan Army. The enemy, which is India, becomes the friendly state of India. And again, the attention is drawn to all of the violent action taken by the Pakistan Army as opposed to the Indian Army. The other newspaper that I looked at is called Dawn, which is a Pakistani newspaper. It is the oldest Pakistani newspaper based in West Pakistan. It was also under martial law. So anything that is published in this newspaper is also censored by the government. And similar to the Pakistan Observer, it labeled India the enemy, and it focused mostly on all the violent action that is taken by India without focusing on what was actually going on in Bangladesh during these months of war. The last newspaper I looked at was called The Statesman. It is based in Kolkata, and it has a reputation of being fair and for covering differing points of views. And here, as you can see, most of the issues that I looked at avoided vilifying Pakistan in any of the titles. And this is one of the very few articles I found where it actually named Pakistan in the title of the news article. And most of the language it used tries to avoid vilifying Pakistan, but again, these are the very few examples I found where it named Pakistan without really vilifying them, essentially. And it also mentioned what was happening in Bangladesh, and it gave voice to the Bangladeshi freedom fighters, which was largely absent from Dawn and from the Pakistan Observer. The second category of sources I looked at are academic articles. These are two academic articles that I thought were the most important to highlight. The first one is focusing on the role of women in war, which was, again, not mentioned in any of the newspapers. And the second one focused on analyzing the role that the New York Times played in 1971 and how it covered the issue for the West. Both of these sources provide very crucial information because the first one provides a lens or gendered analysis of the conflict, and the second one provides an information and conclusion that neither the East or the West newspapers were completely accurate in their reporting of the conflict. But both of these provide a very detached view of the Bangladesh Liberation War, and it doesn't give you a very personal or a psychological connection to the war. The last category of sources I looked at are literary sources, which are the most important. It is this anthology that I looked at, which is the only anthology available about stories from the 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War. These are three of my personal favorites, which I thought were the most powerful. They all memorialize trauma, and they give voice to the people who lived through this war. And they provide a very, they are fictional. Some of them are fictional, some of them are essays, so some of them are autobiographical. And they provide a very impassioned synthesis of the reasons for why people decided to move as a result of this conflict. And it also captured the agony, the confusion, and the grief that people felt during these times of war and conflict and violence. In conclusion, I found that every single source that I looked at is very crucial in understanding the various diplomatic, sociopolitical, and psychological dimensions of the conflict, and each source memorializes the conflict in unique ways. And this is applicable not only for the 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War, but I believe to all conflicts across the world. And I believe in the context of South Asia that memorializing these experiences can help the conflict survivors, and it can especially help bridge the gap or the disconnect that I initially mentioned between the people of Bangladesh and Pakistan. And I hope that sharing these stories can help mobilize people of Pakistan and Bangladesh to support their stateless populations like the Biharis and the ethnic Bengalis. I would want to end by drawing my attention, or your attention, to the urgent need for further research in this area, and the need for urgent support for the establishment of a medium where these stories and these memories of these displaced communities can be memorialized so that we can all come together and we can help them ameliorate their issues. Thank you.
Okay, we have a couple minutes for questions.
Hello. First of all, thank you so much for your presentation. When you mentioned when you were conducting your interviews that there was a pretty big disconnection between the different people that you spoke with, and I was just wondering how you went about navigating such difficult conversations.
That is a great question. I think the way that I handled it is to just minimize how much I contribute to the conversation, where I just let them talk and let them get everything that they needed to get off their chest out of their system. And for one of the people that I talked to, they didn't speak English very clearly, and they weren't very confident in their ability to talk to me in English. So we were able to find a time where his daughter could translate for us, and I think that really helped that conversation because there was a personal connection with his daughter, and it also really helped me look at intergenerational trauma in relation to conflict and how that is transferred from generation to generation. But yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think essentially it's just to let them let everything that they need out of their system.
Thank you.
On a similar note, I noticed that the articles that you showed were written in English. Are those like primarily English-speaking newspapers? And that's kind of made me think about what the audience is for that. Is that like an educated class that speaks English, or is that for like an international audience?
Yes, it's mostly the people within these countries who speak English who are educated, and also for the international audience. That's a great question. And there were many people who didn't speak English, obviously. And I think many of these newspapers, I think they were also available in Urdu, if I'm not mistaken. And there were also other newspapers that were simply published in Urdu. But I believe that the information that was available in those newspapers is very similar to what is published here. But that's a great question. I think it's really important to address the disparity between who has access to this information.
We have time for one more quick question.
I have a question about genre, since you're looking at newspaper articles and academic articles and then fiction and essays. And you mentioned you found the literary sources particularly powerful. Are there things that writers were able to do or express or remember in those sources that it felt like you weren't getting in the newspaper or scholarly articles?
Absolutely. That is a great question. I was going to initially add the paragraphs or the passages that I thought were especially powerful, and I obviously didn't do that because I thought it would be too time consuming because I would just keep talking about them. But they were very, as I said, they give you a very personal account of what happens, and it makes you feel like you're there with them. And it took me a very long time to get through this book because after every story, after every essay, I was just crying because it's so powerful and it connects to you. And the language that they use, a lot of this it was originally published in either Urdu or Bengali, and it was translated. So I think that is also, if it was this powerful in English, I can't even imagine how powerful it would have been in their original languages. So that's a great question, and I think that literary sources, especially for this conflict, are incredibly powerful, and they place you within that conflict, and it makes you feel like it's happening around you. It's incredible. I would highly recommend reading this. It's amazing. I would be happy to pass it around if anybody's interested. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.